Hi, this is Rob Skiff. We're here interviewing Cryn Johannsen with her new book, Solving the Student Loan Crisis, uh, Dreams, Diplomas, and a Lifetime of Debt. There's a link on our screen that you'll see to go to the Amazon.com website so you can purchase it. I've known Cryn for, followed her work for about 2 years, I think it is now. And this book is the culmination of a lot of work. And it's probably actually one of the most important books in higher ed that I've read in the past year because it deals with a section of higher ed that isn't really mentioned or studied, which is the impact of student loan debt on the students themselves, taken from a sort of an anthropological perspective, but really an interview perspective where she's using information that she received on our blog and really telling us the human cost of the student loan debt, but also a really great history of how we got where we are with the debt being larger than that, which is, it's what now? It's 1.5 trillion, Cryn, or something like
It's
that?
1.3.
Or
And it's Cryn,
1.3.
by the way. Cryn.
Cryn, sorry,
That's
Cryn.
all right.
So get out and purchase a copy. And if you have any questions after this interview, you can send them to me at questions@oplerno.com. But you can certainly send them to the author, and we'll make sure they get transferred. So thanks a lot for coming for the interview, for allowing us to talk. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book and what your background is for people who don't know.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I mean, my story is there's a lot of background to it. I was in graduate school. I have multiple degrees, and at one point I was working on my PhD in history, and a lot of the conversations are revolved around student loan debt, both people with debt in graduate school and then also undergraduates. And so there was a preoccupation with that. But to fast forward, I took a leave of absence for my PhD program in 2007, and I thought at that point that moving into publishing, which I do discuss in the introduction, was a good place for me. And so that's what I did, and then I wound up leaving New England and moving to Washington D.C. And at the time, I was married. But it wasn't a fit. Sometimes things that you think are originally going to be a fit professionally are not a fit, and so I I did end up leaving that position after, it was over a year. I mean, it was a great publishing company, but it just was not a fit for me professionally. And at the same time, there was basically the Great Recession, which really was a depression that hit. Unfortunately, at the time, I professionally decided to leave this position, which caused tremendous stress on my marriage. At which point, we decided to leave the country. And of course, the student loans were a big part of the stress that was causing friction with my husband at the time and between the two of us. So that's when I wound up in South Korea. I was hired to teach English as a second language, basically in Seoul. And around that time, I launched All Education Matters, my blog. And, initially, as you can probably imagine with the term or the name of the blog, I was going to explore things related to all education matters, specifically with regards to higher education, because I didn't want to lose sort of touch with my academic and intellectual interests that I obviously had been exploring while I was in grad school and so forth. But the more I began to dig into the topic, student loans became a focal point for me. And at the same time, there was a lot of outrage about the banks being bailed out. I mean, this was public, as we all know, as we recall that history. And so there was a lot of this, a lot of people talking about, well, if the banks have been bailed out, why can't you bail out students? And there were movements, especially on Facebook and so forth. And this preceded Occupy Wall Street, which then, of course, we later saw an amazing group that shot out from that, which is the Occupy Student Debt Campaign, that I have to give a shout out to them because they referenced a lot of my work, acknowledging me, including Andrew Ross, who recommends my book, calling me an anti-debt veteran, which was much appreciated. But I became very involved in this issue of student loan debt because I saw it as a total injustice. Obviously, I am also a student debtor. That's part of my story. But, the concept of higher education is that it's access to a better life in America. I mean, that's the whole point of it. And it's based upon a meritocratic concept. And especially for low income individuals and minorities, this is a stepping stone out of poverty and out of less advantageous situations in the United States. But the more you begin to put the pieces together, you realize that it's actually further entrapment. And unfortunately, those communities are most hurt, much like what happened with the banking crisis and how minorities lost homes and their homes were literally taken from them. I mean, there's evidence of this with Goldman Sachs, and it's a similar story that you see outlined that I demonstrate in the book. They are really the largest swath of the victims, but obviously, I mean, it goes across all demographics, whether you're white, black, Hispanic, etc. But it is indeed a sad story where the less advantaged you are, the more you are taken advantage of in the system, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, you're, pointing out the 2008 debt crisis, the amount of money received by the banks was as much, it could have paid off actually the mortgages of everyone in the United States,
Right.
given that level of, but the banks got it, and not all the banks paid it back.
Nope.
So what you really have in 2008, I was also involved in the Occupy movement in Vermont, and that was a real catalyst for my thinking about adjuncts and about higher ed too and accessibility. You've got really a harvesting of people and of
Right.
people's livelihoods to and a taking of the people's capital and putting it into the financial institutions. And you see that today, like you said, the people who need the loans to go to school are the people who are at the lowest levels in terms of income in the society. And education is a great way to, like you said, improve your position and to, get a family. But since we're relying on student loan debt, on loans to pay for that, the people who are most hurt are, again, like you said, disproportionately the ones who need that type of help. And once you get on that debt bandwagon, whether it's consumer debt, student loan debt, or the mortgage debt, it's next to impossible to get out of it. And so you end up working as much for the banks or more for the banks than you do yourself. That early part of the book, when you're, in chapter 2, when you're talking about, a brief history of U.S. investment in higher ed, you can really see that the whole process, developing in that mindset right after, World War II, and then up to the current day. And the best of intentions created a system that really is not helping out people today. So yeah, excellent.
Well, and Gary Rivlin, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he did he wrote an excellent book. I'm forgetting the title of it. I'm sorry to say, but he covered the history and rise of the payday lending industry. And there's a tremendous amount of overlap with the story that you see with student loan debt, because one of the things that he obviously discusses is that when it comes to poor people, it's obvious that you can make a lot of money off of many poor people versus just one poor person. And I mean, essentially what's happened with student loans as well is that we're all debt instruments, and then as a result of it, personally, we're atomized. And so they're just extracting from millions of us, well, 43 million of us at this point. And then this latest crew to graduate in 2016, they've won the prize of having the most debt now. They have the highest levels of debt. And I'm sure 2017 will beat them as well. So you can continually extract from people. And then on top of it, you're selling the idea that, well, in order to get ahead and to get jobs in whatever sector it is you need to be in, you must have degrees. And so it's a type of entrapment. And then of course you have this ideology here of personal responsibility and the whole myth of individualism, which I'm not even going to go into deeply. But
Oh, come on, let's go into it.
well, it plays a big role because, of course, all the pushback and the criticism of my work and trying to, I mean, this is really systemic abuse, and there's multiple players, as I think I demonstrate in the book: the government, the student lending industry, the universities, both the for-profits and the nonprofits, all entangled with one another. It's very complex. I mean, just looking at one of those institutions alone and considering their role is difficult to explain, not to mention all three of them. But people, love to throw back, oh, well, you made the decision to take out the debt. It's your fault. Pay back the debt. And, the blame is completely misplaced.
Well, it's blame the victim, because I think
Correct.
you
Is right.
you do a great job of showing how the system is designed actually to put people, and I'm using this term specifically, in bondage. Okay.
Right.
Bondage comes from the term bond, because what they're doing is they're taking all these loans, as you know, and aggregating them together and then selling them as financial instruments to other institutions. So it's literally bondage. You're being turned into a bond, and you're being and you can't get out of it. It's involuntary taking of your labor forever that you cannot get out of. I mean,
right.
It is debt slavery, by a nicer, kindler, gentler. Well, it's not that gentle, but by a nicer maybe phrase, or a different phrase than the same types of slavery that has existed in the past. What do you think about?
I mean, I don't think people realize that, one of the concepts, of course, that I talk about, I don't want to skip ahead, but is this idea of collective revolting, which Occupy Student Debt was calling for. And in trying to leverage the concepts that, the union's outline of a type of debt revolt, based upon a debt strike. But of course, the problem is with that, as you're saying, I mean, yes, it seems gentler in terms of the punishments, but the fact of the matter is that there are certain professions that if you default on your loans, you can lose your licensure in certain fields. You run great risk professionally. I mean, that, not to mention, the way in which it destroys your credit, how it's impossible to buy homes because, your debt to income ratio is, for many people, it's pretty outrageous, even just going for a 4-year degree. So the ramifications of it long term is tremendous, and that's something I obviously talk about personally with the dissolution of my marriage.
It's almost as if the systems are making us all sharecroppers. Okay, to be blunt, where we're kind of like always having to pay a larger and larger section of what we earn to the company store, okay,
yeah,
or to the landowner, and we only get a share of our own labor anymore. And you do, with your description of how the stresses hit your own marriage, but also I was blown away by your describing the human impact of this system on people. And you want to just talk a little bit about that, so people can understand, the people behind this whole method of bondage.
I mean, obviously, I think the most difficult is the suicides, which, as you know, I note the worst note I could have ever received was from someone who lost someone in their family, which was last year around this time. Was probably the worst email I've ever received. Sorry.
I'm looking at, it's in your first chapter, A Bleak Future for America.
I mean, it's the number of suicidal people that reach out to me is is difficult. It ebbs and flows, but luckily I've worked with some of them and they've gotten into better places. But the psychological toll just cannot be emphasized enough. And then you consider the way that affects, the interpersonal relationships that these individuals have with, spouses and family and their friends. And then you consider that, you extrapolate that, and how are they performing at their job, and what are they like in their communities if they're suffering to that degree. And it's sad. I mean, it's very, very sad to take that into account.
So there's we kind of have this illusion of prosperity, if you will, or the illusion of hey, now I have an advanced degree.
Right.
I'm supposed to be at this particular place, and then the debt and the financial struggles associated with that. You document really, really well the depression, the anxiety, and the pain that people feel when they are underwater. And the great crime is that these people didn't know what they were getting into.
Right.
At the beginning, that there is such a predatory atmosphere in terms of how colleges are dealing with undergraduates and graduate students and their families about paying for school. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, they're leveraging their futures in ways that I think and I know I can speak, and personally, I didn't realize. You just can't project, into when you're 21 or 22, what the ramifications are. And that doesn't even take into account, I mean, knock on wood, I've not had severe health problems or things like that. I mean, I've talked with people who have been in, one woman in particular, it was a mother. I wrote about her, I think it was for USA Today, but her daughter was in a pretty cataclysmic wreck. I think she became a quadriplegic, if memory serves me, but in the very least, she was paralyzed in her legs. And the parents were fighting with a private lender to have a loan forgiven. And it just the amount of sort of financial chaos that this had created for the parents was just tremendous. And the mother was a nurse, and she had to quit her position to basically become a full-time caretaker for the daughter, who was completely incapacitated from this accident. So those are not things that you consider when you're, graduating, and you're obviously, your future is bright. I mean, that's the way human beings tend to be, right? You're not thinking that, oh my gosh, I could maybe get in a terrible car wreck, or I could get cancer, or, my marriage could fall apart, and then I have to deal with the financial, the financial implications of that, for example. Those are just a few sort of things that you're not considering when you're 22, and
No.
and that's completely fine.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, I remember it at 23. I had to leave the States because I couldn't find a job. This was in 1990. I'm 48. So at the when that recession in the Gulf War started and ended, I got a job in Ecuador for 2 years. And while I was there, I started to apply to graduate school with the idea that, hey, I'm going to go back and get a degree. And I was looking at programs with the idea that I was going to become a tenured professor. And so so I applied to all these anthropology programs, and I didn't get in, but I then got this letter, okay, from the University of Chicago saying, hey, you've been admitted to the Masters of Arts program in the social sciences. And sort of like the notion was that this was the first step, okay, or a different way to get into that field. And lots of programs, you just don't think about the amount of money it costs. And you also, the schools don't really tell you, or didn't in 1990, in the 90s, and I know they're not doing it now. They don't really tell you about or educate you about what you're going to have to pay over the course of the loan. They don't educate you about what are your real job prospects based on your degree. It's almost as if again, they're taking these students, getting them in debt, feeding the system, feeding the machine of the institutions, but also in your book, you really make clear that we're also feeding the budgets of different agencies in the United States and in the government. The
Right.
Department of Ed, and of course all Sally May, and all those different quasi-government entities that are making billions off of the student loan debt, whether it's servicing it, whether it's even going out and finding people who are behind payments and making money from that, tax farming. You really make it clear. Can you talk a little bit about that? And as you were doing the research, what was the thing that was most shocking to you about what was happening, or is probably right now you're not really shocked about, what was the most disillusioning moment that you had
I mean,
where you were like, oh my God,
because I've been writing about this for so long. It's like nothing really shocks me anymore, but it's a good question.
When did you realize you were in the Matrix?
Well, I think though, I want to sort of pivot a bit with the positive side though, with certain people though, who are government bureaucrats
we got disconnected for a second, so we'll go back to our discussion, which was you wanted to point out some of the hopeful things that are happening.
Right. That was sort of in relation to the question about what I found most shocking, and I was referencing the case with Dr. John Oberg, who was a researcher in the Department of Education, and he's sort of he's an example of a bureaucrat who did the right thing, and he continues to do the right thing because he's in litigation, and he's trying to the case has shed light on the wrongdoings of the industry and of the biggest players, and he of course the response to him was terrible, but that's not surprising. But on a good note, as a bureaucrat, you want bureaucrats like that to do that. He did the right thing. He was doing his job the right way. And unfortunately, it was obviously met with a terrible response, but he then followed through with it, which I think is highly admirable. But on top of it, there are new people in the department. A man from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which I do think is a promising new bureau that was created by Elizabeth Warren. It's unfortunate that she didn't head it, but they have done tremendous work to protect and to investigate wrongdoing, specifically with private loans. And there's a newcomer at the Department of Education that had been at the bureau. He just came on board.
But Cryn, can we? I mean, there can be, a handful. There are always a handful, or maybe it's a large number. Maybe let's say it's even 50% of the people do the right thing in terms of these large bureaucracies. But the system seems set up to for the creation of debt and the harvesting, and the exploitation of it.
Absolutely.
And so, what sort of, you touch on this, what's sort of your sense of, is the system going to reform itself, or is it going to have to, is there going to be a major upheaval and collapse of higher ed for things to get better? What's sort of your take? I mean, in the last chapter of the book, you list out what needs to happen in terms of, recommendations that you've got to deal with this. A debt jubilee, which
would be the most ideal.
Yep, and I think it's going to happen.
I wouldn't be surprised.
The debt jubilee is going to happen one way or the other.
Right.
Because people just can't pay it, and unless they're going to throw us all in jail or take everything, and then people will come out with pitchforks and say enough is enough. But one of the recommendations was free public universities. Do you think that, it's not only the government and the loans that are creating the system, okay, this exploitation, but it's also the universities themselves Okay, they're
Of
making a
course.
lot of, and especially, senior administrators and senior tenured faculty are really benefiting from this system. Do you think that if we were to even to subsidize that, that it would, sure, it wouldn't fall on the students because it would be free, but do you think it's going to have a larger impact on making things more affordable and more accessible for people?
Well, I think that look, the way the free public universities, how that is implemented has to be out. And I think someone like, for example, obviously Bernie Sanders, because of where he stands on a lot of these issues, and the types of people he would bring on board in terms of policy implementation, they they have the interests of students in mind. I mean, I'm saying a Sanders type. And that's why I was mentioning some of these insiders at the Department of Education. Because I don't think institutionally you're just supposed to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't believe in just a total abandonment of institutions, by the way. But I do think that I think to answer your question about solutions, and obviously I offer a set of solutions, but if you're looking at it from another perspective, I think it's twofold. I mean, it's internal and it's external. And I think that's why Occupy Wall Street was such a beautiful expression of that, because that's from the ground up. And it was truly collective, and it's something that you don't see here very often. You see this in other parts of the world, much more so. I mean, whenever there's threats of taking things away, for example, in Europe or in France, I mean,
Or
they're
Canada
out
in
on the streets.
the student demonstrations over increased
That
fees
was
was
huge. It was like
huge.
500,000 students
Yep.
and other supporters swarming the streets. It was incredible. And that but Occupy was an example of that. I mean, that's spread like wildfire across the country. And but I don't think that just because those campsites are gone and the actual physical spaces have been cleaned up and they've disappeared, that I think that that's left some kind of indelible mark. So I think that there's internal and external pressure that needs to be to exist, or simultaneously. But in terms of forecasting, it's just so difficult to really say. I mean, we're in such a tremendous moment, a historical moment of change, and especially with Trump, who I've been warning about for a long time. I've never found him funny, especially this latest time around. I think it's clear that he is he's smarter than people like to think he is. At least he's whipping up something that's not going to just go away.
No,
And whether it's
he and Bernie. It's interesting, the current
and
establishment,
correct,
when I look at the left and the right, the power is coming from the two sides who
yes,
can't stand the establishment today. And
right,
I want to go back to your comment about, I agree with you that, we need institutions. We just need very different kinds of institutions than what we've got right now, in charge of, offering education in different ways. That's not to, I'm going to plug Oplerno a little bit, trying to do something where faculty own their content and have a lot more control and students have a lot more choice. We don't necessarily have that. And that's helping to feed some of these, really, and the lack of transparency about the debt and cost is really feeding this kind of abuse that's happening within the system. But yeah, we can't live in
right.
a state of anarchy, and we're going to need institutions. But I really don't. For me, the credibility of higher ed is now really in question. The credibility of our current
Sure.
institutions, and Trump supporters and Bernie's supporters, they can't stand the current establishment. And to be honest, the
No,
current
they're anti-Trump.
establishment has run us into the ground. Darien, Connecticut, and New York City and Greenwich and the West Coast. I mean, it's crazy what they have done, creating this financialization of all of the aspects of our lives for the benefit of the very few people who are issuing the debt and collecting it.
Right.
And that's what I really, I'm excited to see that totally change.
Yeah, and I guess the hope is that it will be bloodless, but one can only one can only wait and see how it unfolds. Um, because the hope is I'm excited as well, but I do hope that it's something that is peaceful, but we just have to see, um, as you know, the months and leading up to the election, what the outcome will be, because obviously what Trump is whipping up is quite violent, as we know,
Yep. If
and also incredibly anti-intellectual.
I think if I really hope Bernie can take the nomination from Clinton.
I think that would probably be beneficial, especially with the work that I've done on student loan debt.
Yep. If Bernie can take the nomination away from Clinton and the current establishment, then I think it's Bernie versus Trump, and Bernie
Correct.
wins. Because people will listen to the better angels of our nature, I think. But if it's Trump versus Clinton, it's going to be a really crazy. It's going to be a really crazy fall, and it's going to be a really crazy election season. No matter who becomes president, I'd rather see Bernie.
It
You
will be a
know,
crazy
I'd rather
election.
see the Hobbit from Vermont come to Washington, and toss the ring in the fire.
Well, even birds like him, like St. Francis, you know.
Yeah. Yep. What's the next project you're working on in terms of another book or the project with the student loan debt? Do you see amongst students the beginnings of a movement like Occupy Wall Street that's a little bit more militant? It seems campuses have been dominated by the Black Lives Matter um, uh, atmosphere, and free speech issues. Are we going to see, or do you see the beginnings of things like the student movement in Quebec, where we're going to have massive amounts of students demonstrating about their indebtedness?
Well, first, in terms of my plans, I mean, obviously, I'm trying to get the word out about this book that I've written. But as a result of writing the book, I've kind of let All Education Matters, my blog, languish, because I've been so focused on getting this out the door. But that is a place that is free content, and I'm going to return and begin nurturing it again, so that people can come to that place and read about all kinds of matters, because I obviously try to follow all sorts of stories related to student loan debt, default, etc., as closely as possible, and provide analysis. And this story is going on over here. This sort of legislation is being introduced, and really trying to create again a sort of a daily, if possible, updates on things related to student loan debt, and being that resource like it had been before. So I'm building up that readership again, because of course, with a blog, as you know, it kind of goes away, if you're not up on it at least once or twice a week, which is completely understandable. So there's that. And I mean, I also do things kind of under the radar that people aren't even aware of, to help individual debtors, and making them aware of the, like, for instance, legal aid resources, because there's been an uptick in after debtors, and I've been kind of overwhelmed with debtors reaching out to me about being served papers and not knowing how to respond to these things. And so I'm not an attorney, of course. I'm an activist and an advocate on behalf of student loan debtors, but I definitely have connections and knowledge of legal aid resources, and trying to get them in touch with the right types of organizations that can assist them when it comes to very serious matters, where if they don't show up to court, they will be arrested, because they'll be held in contempt of the court and so forth, which most of these debtors are fully aware of that. But trying to help them take the first steps in having the rights and the awareness of how they can fight back in a courtroom setting, which unfortunately, like I said, it seems to me like there's been an uptick. That's anecdotal, but I also do note that, like in the state of Florida, for instance, there was one reporter who noted the seizure and threats of taking property by the federal government, there's been a significant increase in this. So I think this will be something that I will be doing more of, which is all, of course, pro bono. I mean, I don't get anything for doing any of this work. Most people don't know I have a full-time job. It's not in any way related to student loan debt. This work is all of service to the debtor community. It's sort of my way of giving back to the community. So that's sort of, to answer your first question, that's the initial plans, is to promote the book and to enliven All Education Matters again. But to answer the second question, in terms of movements, I mean, one reader wrote to me and said that that my book and my personal story has helped energize him and helped him get through the shame that he has about his own debt, and he wants to get involved and he wants to become a student loan activist. And he's working on something creatively, which I think is amazing. And he said, by hook or crook, get it published. And he wants to become more involved. That's really what I push for in my book, is that you yourself take the reins and start getting involved, in your communities. You start talking openly about the debt that you have, because the first step of this issue is overcoming your own shame, which I began realizing when I first started talking about this almost a decade ago. Was my friends have debt? Oh my God. And family members, or whatever, that people start sitting down at the dinner table and they start admitting to each other, if they're out having drinks or they're out on a walk with a friend, start talking about the student loan debt you have, because you're not alone. I mean, that's the thing, that so many of us, I know, feel isolated with the debt. It's very isolating, it's atomizing, and it's been done that way purposefully, I think.
Yep, I agree.
So I think that that's one of the big pieces that I hope people will overcome and begin working on it, and taking it up as their own, and seeing what comes of it. I mean, Occupy Wall Street was a great example of that, and they did amazing work on it. But I will tell you as well, Black Lives Matter, part of their platform is connected to higher education and having good access to education. This is a big piece of what they're also working on that a lot of people aren't familiar with, because, of course, naturally, a big focus of their work, as it should be, is the fact that Black lives don't matter as much as other lives. That's the whole point of it, because they're being gunned down in cold blood. But they have done a superb job of becoming part of the mainstream. But there's subgroups to it I'm aware of that they have demands, and one of which is most certainly connected to higher education, and not just specifically related to issues around freedom of speech and so forth, but also access to higher education and what that means in terms of investing in their communities.
And investing
And I
in
think,
people, and that's a
correct.
hugely important issue. That's great. If you could send me some links to those particular groups, we'll post them right after,
Sure.
or post them underneath your when you're talking, because we have to connect people so that there can be better resistance to what's going on, and change in terms of the current system and the current student loan structure, so that we can address this issue, because it's costing too many lives and creating it's just destroying the opportunity of this next generation, and we've got to end it. We've got to
Well,
completely stop it.
I obviously agree. And on that note, I want people to be aware of an organization that's based in Boston called the National Consumer Law Center, nclc.org. And they are a great resource in terms of information related to loans and ramifications. They also work with the Department of Education, trying to push for change policy-wise, which I do note also in my book. So people just aren't aware of these resources, and they've been around a very long time, and they're well regarded, and their research is very solid, and it's incredibly helpful for debtors
Great.
to go and find those resources that they write about.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. That's a good note to end. Please buy this book. Okay, it's really, really important. It's probably, you know, like I said at the beginning, it's one of the most important books on higher education that you're going to read this year. And it's a very big issue. That, and along with exploitation of adjuncts, of adjunct faculty, are the two critical components in higher ed that are making it less than what it could be. And so we need to change higher education from the ground up. In my opinion, we need to reform it. And so thank you very much, Cryn. Really appreciate the time, and good luck in everything, and hopefully we can keep in contact.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Thanks, Rob.
Yep, great. So thank you very much for tuning in, and remember to tune in next week for another Higher Education Revolution meeting. I had another really interesting conversation with someone who just handles financial aid, because one of the things that I've been doing is taking a look at, you know, student loan debt in its relationship to financial aid and how financial aid gets calculated. Okay, the calculations are pretty straightforward, and to be perfectly honest, they're quite fair in terms of they look at, in the U.S., the income levels of the parents,
inspired disposition or perspective on what learning means for anyone. I feel like we can very, very quickly change the discussion on how do we find the next $1 trillion of funding for the next generation of higher ed learners, and how do we inspire them to sort of create their learning for themselves.